And we welcome you to What's Next, Forecasting the Post-Pandemic Landscape. And I've been looking forward to this panel. I don't know about you, but I think a lot of us who have any interest in politics and government have been seeing the things going on, and we've been asking ourselves a lot of questions about what's been going on. I mean, you might be wondering how much of what the government's done now will they try to keep doing, or you might be wondering whether we as citizens are going to be willing to continue all of this social distancing. You know, what's the future look like? And so we've got a great group of panelists here today, and I'm looking forward to what they have to share with us and how they're going to, prognosticate a little bit. We'll see how many of them are actually prophets and and get it all right. But anyway, we're looking forward to what they have to share with us. If you have not joined us on previous webinars, we've done 3 previous, all part of the Keep the Flame Burning series that we've been running, and they started on Monday. The webinars that we have done are going to be posted on our Regent website. In fact, one of them I know is already there at regent.edu/CCTV or CCTA. If you were to go to that page, you would see Great Talks. And in the Great Talks series is all the webinars that have been going on from Regent University, and ours will be there as well. And you should also get some links in follow up to this webinar series, where we will send you the links where you can access them if you don't get a chance to see the whole thing or whatever, so you can watch it that way. But we are looking forward to a great panel for the next hour and a half or so. We're going to have an hour of the panelists talking and discussing. We want you to post questions. Down at the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A bubble, and if you click on that, it will allow you to post a question. When you post that question, our co-moderator today, Kylan Griffith, will be taking those. She will be figuring out which ones will be good questions for our panel, and then reading them for the last 30 minutes or so of the panel. At the end of that hour and a half, I'm going to be introducing our guest keynote speaker, Attorney General John Ashcroft, who will be closing out our last 15 minutes or so of our webinar series. And so we are looking forward to what he has to share. He was, of course, Attorney General during another time of big change in the United States during 9/11 and following up on that and all the things that changed. So as we are looking at the future, looking at the post-pandemic landscape, he'll be a great closeout today. But first, let me introduce you to our moderator for today's session. Dr. A.J. Nolte is an assistant professor and the coordinator of the MA in Government program at Regent University. He is currently building a new degree program in international development, which we hope will get started in 2021. Dr. Nolte received his PhD in politics from Catholic University of America. His dissertation focused on the relationship between political Islam and high modernism in Turkey and in Indonesia's state formation process. He received an MA also from Catholic University in 2009. He has worked for the Religious Freedom Project at Georgetown University's Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace and World Affairs, and at the Center for Complex Operations at National Defense University. He has taught at Messiah College, George Washington University, Catholic University, and National Defense University. He's published in Providence Magazine and is becoming known for his blog, Blind Politics, which is also hosting a live stream of this webinar today. So welcome, Dr. Nolte, and I will let you take it from here.
Thanks very much, Dean Perry. And remind me to always have you read my bio from now on. Well, thanks very much, Dean Perry, and thanks to all of our great panelists. Thank you also to those of you who are attending today. We're so glad that you could be with us for what I think is going to be a very exciting panel. Our topic today is What's Next? Forecasting the Post-Pandemic Landscape. Remember, a couple of weeks ago, I was reading an article that was provocatively titled, "This Pandemic Will Change Us. We Just Don't Know How Yet." And that got me thinking about what exactly the future of this would be. I think there are 2 things that we can say with a high degree of certainty. The first one is that at some point, the current moment, the current crisis that we're in will come to an end. And when it does, second point, it will change us, it will change our culture, it will change the political landscape in ways that are hard to forecast. Think about 9/11. 9/11 was something that happened in one city in the United States. 3,000 lives were lost. It took place in one day. Of course, the after effects lasted a lot longer. But 9/11 was a transformative event for US politics in many ways, and in fact, for global politics in many ways. The coronavirus has already lasted longer. It has had a profound economic impact on the US and the world already. And so I think that in the same way we talk about pre and post 9/11 politics, we may also be able to talk about pre and post coronavirus politics, pre and post corona. But what is post corona going to look like? Well, to discuss that issue with us today, we have a distinguished panel, both from the US and internationally. And I'm going to introduce them in no particular order, except we will alternate from some of our US and our international panelists. We begin with Dr. Fallah Hassan Musa, who currently serves as a project manager for the Institute for War and Peace Reporting, IWPR, where he oversees a project empowering existing grassroots media organizations working in the areas of Iraq, liberated from ISIS, and their surrounding multi-ethnic communities to promote tolerance and peaceful coexistence and to counter and prevent extremism. From 2008 to 2012, Dr. Musa served as the executive, in the executive office of the President of Iraq as his public management and communications advisor. Previously, he served as the Director General of Media and Communications for the Iraqi presidency and as manager of the Media and Public Affairs Directorate for the post-war Iraqi Council of Ministers. Dr. Musa was a senior political journalist from 2000 to 2004 for Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, and lecturer in Oriental and African Studies at the University of Gothenburg, Sweden. Dr. Musa holds a PhD in linguistics and an MA in Arabic Studies and an MA in Slavic languages from Gothenburg University, and a postgraduate diploma in communications and media from Leicester University. John Gizzi is Newsmax's chief political columnist and White House correspondent. Known as the man who knows everyone in Washington, he also has extensive connections with state and local elected officials and party leaders across the country. He has appeared on countless radio and TV shows in America and Europe. Gizzi was recipient of the William A. Rusher Award for Journalistic Excellence and was named Journalist of the Year by the Conservative Political Action Conference in 2002. Dave Hoppe is the only person to have served as Chief of Staff to both the Speaker of the House and the Senate Majority Leader. As Chief of Staff to Speaker Ryan, he directed the transition of Ryan's congressional office into a Speaker's office.
And on live television.
Hoppe led the Senate Majority Leader's office during the Clinton and Bush 43 administrations. In this job, he oversaw and coordinated the flow of legislation through Congress, which required working with political personalities on both sides of the aisle, as well as the White House. Hoppe's other Hill positions included Chief of Staff to Jack Kemp during his presidential bid, Chief of Staff to Senator Dan Coates, and Energy and Environmental Policy Analyst for the Republican Study Committee. In 2003, Hoppe left the Hill to work for the public affairs firm Quinn Gillespie & Associates, serving as president of QGA from 2007 to 2011. In 2011, he returned briefly to the Senate to direct the whip office for Senator John Kill. He served as a senior advisor to the Bipartisan Policy Center and is an emeritus member of the board of Easter Seals of DC, Maryland, and Northern Virginia. Hoppe was chairman of the Government Affairs Committee for the National Down Syndrome Society, and served on the board of the Coalition to Promote Self-Determination, a group of organizations working to empower disabled individuals to achieve greater independence. Moving back across the pond, we have Dr. Pavel Kaleta, who serves as an advisor to the Parliamentary Working Group of the European People's Party in the European Parliament. For those who aren't familiar, the European People's Party is the largest center-right party in the European Parliament. A lawyer and political scientist, Dr. Kaleta has earned degrees from the University of Warsaw, the English and European Law Center of the University of Cambridge, and the Catholic University of Leuven. He is the author of books and other publications on international affairs, comparative social security, Polish politics, and European Union law. Dr. Louis Perron is a political scientist and consultant who has advised 2 presidents, a vice president, 2 cabinet members, 5 senators, 3 big city mayors, and a former Miss Universe. He has worked in 6 countries and has won more than 15 competitive election campaigns, including 3 nationwide ones. In his home country, Switzerland, Louis has advised political parties and candidates in all 3 linguistic areas, some of the country's biggest companies and interest groups. His international clients are from Germany, Romania, the United Kingdom, and several Asian countries. Before running his own consulting firm, Louis worked for one of the leading US political consultants, Mark Mellman and the Mellman Group, in Washington, D.C. Louis earned a PhD in political science at the University of Zurich and a master's degree from George Washington University's Graduate School of Political Management. He is currently teaching a class in political marketing at the Institute for Political Science at the University of Zurich, and previously taught 2 elective courses at De La Salle University's Graduate School of Business in Manila, the Philippines. He's the author of a newly published book, How to Overcome the Power of Incumbency in Election Campaigns, and has contributed to the Routledge Handbook on Political Management. Finally, we have Howard Kalugyan, who served as the assistant Republican leader in the California State Assembly during his 6 years in office. He was chairman of the CalPERS Oversight Committee, where he proposed converting the public employee pension system to a defined contribution plan in 1995, which would have eliminated all unfunded liability exposure, something that probably people in California are now very much wishing had happened. This proposal was later adopted in 9 other states, and Speaker Newt Gingrich appointed Assemblyman Kalugyan as a delegate to the National Summit on Retirement Savings. Additionally, he was chosen to represent California as the state chair of the National Council of the National Council of State Legislatures and the state chair of the American Legislative Exchange Council. After serving the maximum number of terms in office due to term limits, he joined Hillsdale College in 2001, where he continues to serve as the National Planned Giving Associate. Kalugyan launched the historic Recall Gray Davis Committee, which helped launch the first recall of a governor in California history, Governor Gray Davis. And he also founded Move America Forward, an organization which has sent millions of dollars worth of care packages to our deployed troops here in the United States. Kalugyan served as a member of the Ronald Reagan Legacy Project and led the Defend Reagan Committee, persuading CBS Viacom not to broadcast a miniseries smearing President Reagan. He co-founded and is currently the chairman of the Tea Party Express, the most aggressive an influential national Tea Party group in the political arena. Most of all, Mr. Kalugian describes himself as a proud conservative. So as you can see, we have a very distinguished panel. Once again, thank you all for joining us on this panel this morning, and we look forward to hearing what you have to say about these topics. I want to begin with a question about something that was on the minds of people across the political spectrum before we saw the emergence of coronavirus, and that is the rise of populism. We saw populist movements both in the United States and internationally, and populist movements on both the left and the right. We could think about the election of President Donald Trump here in the United States, or the two presidential campaigns of Senator Bernie Sanders. Obviously, those are two gentlemen on opposite sides of the political spectrum. And we could even look internationally at populist movements on the nationalist side of the spectrum, populist movements sort of more on the right, and also some growing movements advocating for certain types of socialism. We could think about sort of Jeremy Corbyn's rise to leadership in the Labour Party in Britain. So my question for you panelists is, what impact do you think the coronavirus will have on the future of these populist movements that were really coming into their own before the crisis? And what are the greatest pitfalls and opportunities you think populist and more traditional or established politicians will face in the aftermath? Let's go in reverse order of the bios that were introduced. So Howard Kalugian, we'll start with you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Nolte. That's a very good question, actually. You know, the populism movement has been going on now for quite some while here in America, especially. In fact, that's probably what the Tea Party movement was. When we started the Tea Party Express back in 2010, we had a nationwide bus tour, and we've ended up with 13 national bus tours. And in the very first few, we would ask, how many people here have been involved before in political campaigns? And about 90–95% of people were not involved at all. That was their first activity, getting involved with the Tea Party movement. But then come 2016, their involvement had flipped. And it was only about 5% who were there for the first time. Everybody else had gotten involved and either gravitated into campaigns or into government and involved themselves very directly. So I think that what we learned through that was that people were very upset that their leaders were ruling them in a poor way. They were not ruling them as servants. They were instead trying to direct them in ways that they didn't want to go, through these bailout movements and the international conglomerates and the various multinational treaties instead of the bilateral treaties. And I think the election in 2016 of Donald Trump was somewhat of a culmination of that populist movement, because he said, no, we're not going to be a government for the world. We're going to be a government for America first. We're not going to have 20 and 30 and 35 and 40 countries agree to one treaty. We're going to have bilateral treaties, one nation to one nation. And I think that resonated with the populist movement here in America. The Bernie Sanders movement that you mentioned also drew people that were new to politics in many ways. They hadn't been involved before, they didn't trust the leadership, and so they wanted to get involved and help bring about change. So in many ways, that populist movement has gone into government now and is represented by those two main figures. So I think that that'll probably continue. A lot of people are losing trust in government because they see predictions that are being made that are not being fulfilled. We are being governed by science, supposedly, instead of being governed by consent. And people are losing faith that we're actually getting the full story. Because most people that I've been in contact with don't believe we're getting the complete story on the current pandemic and the current problem. And they don't see the relationship between the policies being directed and the need to control the pandemic. After all, in past pandemics, whether it was tuberculosis or smallpox, or even if there was a leprosy outbreak, what you would do is quarantine the sick. And here we're quarantining the healthy. And that doesn't make a lot of sense to people. And they're anxious to get back to work and come out of their homes and stop the policies that we've been living under for so many years, so many weeks now.
Great, thank you. Moving over to you, Dr. Louis Perrone. You've got a little bit of a comparative experience with having worked in a bunch of different parts of the world. So maybe if you could give us a 30,000-foot view of how you think populism is going to be impacted in some of the different contexts that you've worked in.
Well, yes, and that's the problem. I think populism is one of those words where everybody in politics talks about it, journalists, pundits, but actually we don't really agree on what it really means. And probably we could do a whole panel on what populism really is and where it started, a definition, and if it is rising or not, or was rising or not. This being said, I think one of the consequences of this crisis, which is really global, we're all in this together, in a very similar situation or comparable situation. I think one of the consequences is that the political demand and tolerance for, I would say, anti-intellectual clowns as head of governments and presidents is really going down. I think people understand that it helps to have people in office who are serious, because it takes science, experts, and governing is serious business. So I think that's one of the consequences of this crisis. And speaking of the pitfalls, I would say, and I'm telling this to all my clients, is even if you do a good job and are likely to get a boost in the ratings and maybe heading into re-election in a comfortable position, don't sit on the lead. I think the pitfall would be that you have to reinvent yourself very fast. That once this crisis is over, probably people want to turn the page. So even those leaders who are seen doing a good job, who've seen that their survey ratings increase, as we have seen, for example, in Germany or in France, even to some extent in Canada, other countries, I think don't rest on this boost. Reinvent yourself very fast, because people will want to turn the page.
Very good. Dr. Pavlicoletta, over to you. Any particular thoughts on this?
Well, first of all, let me extend my thanks for being invited to this distinguished panel, to the Regent University and to the Dean, and of course the faculty, and if I may say so, to my old friend Hank Johns. Coming to the point, I'd say that perhaps I'm representing here a slightly different point of view, a European-centric, if you like, but I'd say that my own analysis would resonate to a great extent to what Dr. Perron has just said. In that sense that, well, what is populism? We could say that the difference, in a sense, between populists and mainstream politicians, as it's being formulated in the question here, is perhaps defined, the division line between whether they have succeeded or not, because we perceive the populist movements and as a sort of grassroots, bottoms-up insurgency. Well, then the difference is whether they have succeeded or not. In a certain sense, yesterday's populists are tomorrow's mainstream politicians, or today's populists. My own attempt at a take at this issue, this question here, would be that we'd have to distinguish the short-term and the long-term consequences. Now, in the short term, we're already seeing a lot of this rallying around the flag effect around the government of the day, whether the government in question is right-wing, left-wing, center, or downright weird. That's the short term. In the long term, well, I would say that, yes, Dr. Perron, unless today's mainstream politicians don't reinvent themselves in the view of the effects, longer term effects of this crisis, well, they might see themselves not only sidelined, but being replaced in the sense of yesterday's populists becoming mainstream politicians. So in the longer term, I would expect exactly that. The survival, if you like, of the fittest. I'm terribly sorry about this Darwinism, but I would say that that's what it will amount to. In a certain sense, that's what it always amounts to in politics. So perhaps it's a cliche what I'm saying now. That said, well, that would be my thoughts, my initial take on the question here, which I hope you'll find perhaps entertaining or amusing, or at least sufficient. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you, Dr. Coletta. And I'll just echo your comment, thanking Professor Henry Jones here at Regent, who facilitated bringing a lot of these folks into the panelists, the panel and the webinar, and who is also a good friend to many of us here. Turning to Dave Hoppe, you have a lot of experience working with folks on the Hill, sort of advising people who are in the legislative process, in the legislative arena. I'd be very curious for your take on number one, how populism affects the legislative process, how these different rising populist movements have affected legislation. And number two, how do you think current politicians are going to try to factor for some of the enduring dynamics that our panelists have been talking about so far? The challenges of people wanting expertise on one hand, but also kind of having a certain skepticism of it on the other. If you're a politician right now going through this, if you're somebody serving in office, how are you dealing with all the crazy cross currents now, and what are you looking at in terms of the future?
There are many different shades of populism. As was stated earlier, we could spend weeks talking about it, but one of the ways that populism manifests itself is through policy ideas. If you want to look at, I will call a recent one, which will probably tell you how old I am. Back in 93 and 94 in the United States, Hillary Care was the fascination of the Clinton administration. And Hillary Care led directly to a populist movement against socializing healthcare in the United States, and led to the defeat of the Democrats in the elections, in the midterm elections in 94, so that the Republicans recaptured both the House and the Senate. And the contract with America, which the House members ran on, the House Republicans ran on, was a policy document. It was a populist policy document. Some of the issues were put in on the contract for America because they polled well and polled positively. So as well as being a fascination with individuals, populism is also a fascination with policy ideas. And I think that's what you see partially happening right now is as we move through this now, obviously most difficult time, candidates are looking to how they can, first of all, deal with the immediate problems. And the immediate problem was the health problem. The secondary problem was the economic problem, which you saw as they dealt with in the Congress of the United States dealt with. They passed 4 pieces of legislation in about a month and a half. And one of them was a reaction to one of the first 3 where they hadn't funded enough money for small businesses to try and rescue those small businesses. But it's a policy fascination. And what they're trying to do is both deal with the healthcare effects as well as now the economic effects. As we go further and further along the line, the economic effects are going to take priority. If you look in the polls in the United States already at this point, the economic issues seem to be polling as more important than the healthcare issues as the trend line starts to go down on the number of incidents of COVID cases. But what the individuals are going to have to do as they're running for in their elections this fall is be able to provide for their constituents a vision of the future that tells them how we are going to reorganize the United States and reorganize our economy to meet the challenges which we have faced in an economy which was shut down by the government, by actions of the government. And let me end this. One hopeful thing is that this hasn't all been controlled through the central federal government. A lot of this has been sent to the states and in some cases the localities to handle it, which I think is a very positive thing. And it's a good thing that we had the Trump government who wanted to do things at the state level and work with the states and work with localities to handle the individual problems they had.
If you never knew that your local mayor was one of the most important political officials in your life, you probably know that now. Piggybacking off that idea that populists promote policies and pivoting to John Gizzi, the man who knows everyone in Washington. I'm kind of curious, 2 things. Number one, what are you hearing in terms of some new populist policy ideas that might be emerging in response to this? And number 2, having seen a lot of the rise and fall of these policy initiatives that maybe come from the grassroots, what are some ideas that you might project that could be really important in American politics as we come out of the end of this?
I think probably the best way to sum up the current developments with the coronavirus and government's response to it is that you don't know what's going to happen one day to the next, and new ideas come up. As King Lear said, you have the ebb and flow by the moon. In particular, I think the very strong conservative notion of devolution and returning power to states and, even more importantly, localities is enjoying revival right now. And many local officials, by being able to determine who is ill, what businesses can reopen, what people can go back to work, and doing it on a strictly local level where they're able to see firsthand the effects of the virus and whether going back to work will be a threat, that's going to be very key. I spoke recently to Tim Moore, the Speaker of the North Carolina House, who disagrees respectfully with his state's Democratic governor and said one should trust the localities on this issue. And I think certainly Professor Perrone and others would agree on Europe that this has already been happening. In Italy, for example, the League has suffered. The conservative populist movement, which did so well in the EU elections, suffered because of some of its rhetoric, and yet its local leaders, Governor Zaia of Venice, for example, has the highest approval rating from voters because he's been able to deal with the crisis on a local level. So I think mainly the idea of local control and devolution enjoys revival now as a result of the crisis, and that the populist politicians or conservative populist politicians who adapt to that are going to succeed. Let Italy be an example. North Carolina and Howard Kaloogian's home state of Michigan can be others.
Very good. I'd like to pivot now to another region of the world, the Middle East, as we talk to Dr. Fala Musa. Before the outbreak of the coronavirus, we were seeing widespread regional protests over issues of governance. Issues such as garbage collection that was not happening in Lebanon, issues of perceived high levels of Iranian interference in the politics of Iraq. Even in Iran itself, there were some protests that had been going on for a long time in the run-up to the coronavirus. Now, I would imagine some of that has died down, but how, if at all, do you think those sort of movements calling for better governance in the region might be affected by the coronavirus and by the responses of various different Middle Eastern governments?
Yeah, actually, the coronavirus or the pandemic will accelerate the trends that had existed before in the region. And mainly it will continue to be no change will happen in the regional policies, and that is the absence of regional cooperation, and the most policies of MENA region countries is only to fulfill their own national interests. That's why, if we are looking on the concepts actually of the populism, I know that there is a lot of speculation around this term, but if we understand it as anti-establishment and anti-elite, then it's going very good for this term in the Middle East. Why? Because we know that the reason behind the rise of the populist parties, it's not only in Europe and even such movements in the Middle East, is the financial and social crisis, in addition, of course, to multiculturalism, which is mainly in Europe. So the coronavirus now is spreading while we are seeing that many countries in MENA region are facing economic and political unrest, such as in Iraq. You have mentioned Lebanon, we have Libya, we have Yemen, Egypt as well. I guess less cross-border cooperation will continue existing between the Arab countries and between the countries in the Middle East region. We will see more isolation in these countries. And of course, these countries are going to use the pandemic in a political way. We have seen in Iraq and in Lebanon how the government and the political class, they insist to include the demonstrations in the measures to counter coronavirus. So I mean, the post coronavirus, I guess, will support strongly the phenomenon actually of populism even in the Middle East, and we will see less and less cross-border cooperation between the Arab countries as well.
Very good, thank you all. I want to pivot a bit and actually use a little bit of sort of the end of Dr. Musa's comments about populism and sort of the lack of responsiveness of some of the elites in some of these Middle Eastern countries. To pivot to another more international topic, but one that I think is going to have increasing salience for our American audience as well, and that is the topic of the People's Republic of China. There's been a lot of scrutiny both in the United States and elsewhere of the role the Chinese Communist government played early on, particularly their role in perhaps not being as forthcoming as they might otherwise have been about information related to this crisis at the beginning. And it seems as though there is increasingly skeptical sentiment toward the PRC and Xi Jinping in the United States and elsewhere. However, we've seen other countries. I would note Russia. I would posit probably Iran here, fitting into this category as well, that have used this as an opportunity to sort of try to strengthen their ties with Beijing and with the communist government. Curious how all of you think this is going to play out. And starting with Dr. Musa, we'll go in snake order here, so reverse the order from last time. I would like to narrow this question down a little bit and talk about particularly the Iranian regime and their response to the coronavirus, which has generally been seen as not as effective as the response of some other governments. Maybe they've also been, it has argued that they have been sort of covering up the scope of the situation. Do you think that weakens the regime? And given the fact that this likely came to them from China, how are various different forces within Iran looking at their connection with the PRC moving forward?
Yeah, actually, as I have mentioned, in the MENA region, the countries there, the policies are going to continue as they are right now. We will not witness any change. The Iranian regime will continue to its policies, which are practicing right now, and this is the domination. And we are seeing what they are doing in Lebanon, in Iraq, in Libya. They are trying with all their forces, of course, to use these countries, and this is what's happening right now, even in Iraq, when they are starting to be involved in the formation of the new government. And as for the China, so we all know that the Chinese economy will take the most of the impact of the crisis, especially in sectors such as tourism, transportation, mobile industry, the international trade. And this, of course, will impact very negatively on the implementation of the initiative which China just established. This is the Belt and Road Initiative. The Chinese government, of course, they will not be able to meet the financial cost for this initiative, and they will not succeed to increase the number of Chinese workers working in other countries. And this is the main target, actually, for the Belt and Road initiatives. This we can see very clearly in Iraq and in Dubai. In Dubai, China, they just won a huge amount of contracts for infrastructure related to Expo 2020, which was supposed to be in Dubai. But now Dubai has postponed this event. And at the same time, because of coronavirus, Dubai now is suffering from a very serious financial crisis. There is no tourism there. The prices of oil decreased dramatically, so they will not be able to pay for China. The same thing we are witnessing in Iraq. We know in September 2019, Iraq signed an agreement with the government of China. They call it Oil for Reconstruction. This is supposed to be a huge future project which should last until 2030. But now, I mean, Iraq, to finance this agreement with China, has to increase the oil production. But what's happening on the ground is after the latest OPEC agreement, Iraq has to decrease the oil production in about 1 million barrels per day. So that means this agreement will not be implemented. And at the same time, the money, this we have seen in Iraq recently, actually, the money which Iraq has saved for this agreement, Iraq started to use them for purchasing different equipments and services from China. Yeah, thank you.
Very good, thank you very much. Pivoting to some of the responses here in the US and turning to John Gizzi, there's been something of an unspoken consensus in Washington with respect to China that trade liberalization and sort of working to strengthen ties between our two countries was a policy that was going to be a win-win, a win for us economically, and possibly also would lead to democratization. I would say it probably begins, although it doesn't consolidate, under the Nixon administration with Nixon's trip to China, although I would defer to some with more Washington experience on that point. Do you see that consensus as being able to survive the current coronavirus? And if not, what is likely to replace it as the new attitude toward China among Washington policymakers?
First of all, I would go back to 1978 if you want to pinpoint a date several years after President Nixon went to China, when President Jimmy Carter officially jettisoned Taiwan and recognized the Beijing government as the legitimate government of China. Most of the capitals in the world followed that example, to where only a few maintained embassies with Taiwan, home of the Republic of China, and the rest recognized the PRC. That was almost a signal from the Carter administration and reflected a reversal from both the Nixon and Ford administration, which hoped to keep Taiwan in the picture. I do believe that we are now reversing that process, and coupled with the president's own reverse of trade on China, the application of tariffs, and the hostility to China after Wuhan, we have seen a president who is not only friendly to Taiwan, but recognizes it in everything but name only. when he was president-elect, Donald Trump broke tradition by taking a call from the president of Taiwan. In addition, when Taiwan had its recent elections, Secretary of State Pompeo issued a congratulatory message to the re-elected president. And in fact, there is an excellent relationship between this administration and the Democratic Party that is presently the ruling party in Taiwan. One other factor on this, Taiwan was one of the first countries that detected what it called unusual pneumonia, their term, in Wuhan back in December. They had their own bout with the SARS, the disease that results from the coronavirus, and they issued warnings not only to Beijing, but to the World Health Organization. They got polite thank you very muches and no action. In the meantime, Taiwan has won the world's applause by having an early lockdown, regular briefings by its vice president, who is a trained physician from Johns Hopkins University, and volunteering to give both the United States, the EU, and other countries free masks that it manufactured. So overall, I think we'll see a harder line with China, very possibly a new Cold War, and just as significant, a new relationship, indeed a revival of friendship with the Republic of China on Taiwan.
I thank you for bringing that up. I think the developments with Taiwan, the general global approval of Tsai Ing-wen and her government's handling of this situation, and all of those, the dynamics that are sort of reemerging, where people are recognizing, hey, there's this democracy of 24 million people that has regular peaceful transitions of power that we all just sort of pretend doesn't exist. I think that dynamic is fascinating, is going to be very interesting moving forward, and I'm glad you brought that to our attention this morning. Looking to the Hill, Dave Hoppe, if let's assume that what Mr. Gizzi just mentioned is correct, that there is a real shift in the sort of political attitudes of folks in Washington and outside of Washington with respect to China. What are some legislative things that we might expect to come out of that, and how might folks on the Hill respond if there is sort of a push for something of a tougher line toward the PRC?
Well, I think there is going to be a change, and you're starting to see it on the Hill. One thing I would say is the professional relationship that the State Department Foreign Service has had with China over these years, which has controlled administrations, Republican and Democrat, since 1978, is gone. And that, in my opinion, is a very good thing, because I don't think they understood China very well. What's starting to happen, you're starting to see that, first of all, people want to bring some of the manufacturing back from China, particularly in terms of medicine, medical equipment. Secondly, the United States, realizing that China is building a blue water navy bigger than our navy, is responding by building up our navy. And that must be done. Otherwise, we will not be able to compete with the Chinese. And as we move forward on this, I think you'll see some bipartisan efforts to do both of these things. Exactly how we're going to get all this done, given the amount of money we've already spent, is not clear. But I think one of the things that will happen most directly is you'll start seeing sectors of the economy, starting with the medical, both medicines and medical equipment, being pulled back from China. And then you'll see other sectors of the economy in which our government will say, we ought to have a native ability, either through our own capacity here in the United States or dealing with our allies, to be able to get these items, not have to deal with our adversaries, the Chinese or the Russians, to get these things.
Great, thank you for that. Pivoting to, and I'm really glad that you set me up for a perfect segue by talking about the Chinese and the Russians in the same sentence. One of the things that's really been striking to me is the degree to which Vladimir Putin and sort of the Russian government have really tried to position themselves as friends and allies of China in the midst of this, and particularly the ways that they have sort of made overtures to Xi Jinping and so on and so forth. Looking at the sort of changing dynamic from an Eastern European perspective, turning to Pavel Kaleta, what are Eastern European governments thinking right now in terms of the relationship with China that may have existed before, and also the possibility of sort of Russia and China drawing closer together?
Well, first of all, I'd say that we're dealing here with a multifaceted question. And I'm not surprised by the focus here being put mostly on China. As you know, in Europe, in the European Union, even though I'm speaking here in completely personal capacity, just for myself, we have a slightly different view of China, or at least we've had a slightly different view of China hitherto, even already during the present crisis. That said, I would say that the movement away from being seen so closely linked to China, especially economically in terms of trade, etc., similar to what Mr. Hoppe mentioned just a moment ago, I think such a movement is also ever so slightly becoming perceptible here in the European Union as well. Of course, the problems we've encountered with medical devices, the equipment, and so on have contributed to that. That said, perhaps now coming more directly to your specific question, well, I wouldn't say this is a perspective only. From the way we see it here in Central and Eastern Europe, this cooperation between Russia and China has been a fact for quite a long time now. And if you allow me to make a comparison, a historical one that perhaps some of you will find outlandish or exaggerated, well, the way I see it, personally, these countries you mentioned, Russia, China, also Iran, are motivated by their common desire, so to speak, to, for lack of a better word, formulation, subvert the presently existing international order. Now, 80 years ago, we've seen another attempt right in the heart of Europe to have a subversion in the existing international order. And I must say that this is an example showing to us that Russia is specifically a country that has certain experience in working hand in hand with others, with whom they do not ever always see eye to eye, with whom they have real divisions in terms of interests, outlooks, points of view, etc. If this contributes to the idea of subverting an existing international order that doesn't conform to, let's say, Russia's interests or self-perceptions or plans for the future. So I would say that, at least as far as Poland is concerned, we've been aware of, well, them going hand in hand for quite a long time now, both the current government and the previous governments. And I'd say that not much has changed in that sense. I'd say more changes are seen really in the western part of Europe, where I must also say that, coming back perhaps for a moment to the previous question about the populists, well, the way we see it, we see those populists right, left, and, well, and weird, perhaps a little too eager to work together with, well, regimes like the Chinese, like also sometimes Russians, because I would say, that's again my personal perception, those populists in Europe are sometimes having a sensation that, well, working to subvert an established order of things on this or another level might contribute to their own, well, political interests. Lega in Italy has been mentioned here beforehand. Well, I'm not an expert in Italian politics, but as far as I know, this would be one of the prime examples. These politicians building a grassroots movement opposing certain, well, let's say not very well considered actions of their hitherto governments, they are, well, again, a little perhaps too eager to, well, accept the extended, well, hand of China or other such regimes. So, well, let's say this is the point of view I would like to share here. Thank you.
If I can summarize, sometimes the enemy of my enemy is also a very dangerous enemy. Pivoting to Luis Perón and sort of addressing a slightly different question. So you mentioned in your bio that you have advised corporations on political communications and in the past. I'm curious about a hypothetical situation. So say you are brought on as a consultant to advise a corporation on the strategic and political and communications realities of whether to do business with China in the future. What advice are you giving that hypothetical corporation about the possibilities of business in China over the next couple of years.
In what country is that company you're talking about?
Let's go with your home country of Switzerland, just as an example.
Well, you know that Switzerland is neutral and has been very apt at doing business with everybody who is willing to do business with them, and sometimes got punished for it. And I don't feel pity for them when they got. I mean, but I would like to answer also your original question, and sure. I can't resist because I can't resist turning around the question and show you the mirror, because there's all this talk about backlash against China, and who knows what will happen, because we don't really know what's happening there. We don't have that much information. At the same time, I would like to share that I'm actually surprised about the backlash against the US. I mean, I'm just, don't shoot the messenger here. I'm just telling you that I've been talking to a lot of politicians, a lot of journalists, and that many people seem to think here in Europe that, well, China has handled it pretty well, but look at the US, what they're doing. I mean, it's not really an infomercial coming out of the White House right now, or out of the briefing room. So while we're talking about the backlash, I think, again, not really an infomercial coming out of the briefing room. And as a small country, Switzerland, we're looking at all these superpowers, and they're all working in their own self-interest. And it looks like very unstable to me and very uncertain what will happen.
Very interesting. Pivoting to Howard Kaligian, obviously in the United States, we've got an election coming up. And I have to think that this whole question of China is going to be a little bit of a political issue in the 2020 election. And I'll throw this question open to you, and then give other panelists a chance to jump on it if it seems just too juicy. If you are either the Trump campaign, the Biden campaign, or both, how are you addressing the sort of issue of China and China's response to the coronavirus in this presidential campaign?
I think that Mr. Perrone had mentioned earlier that politicians have to turn the page quickly once they have accomplished something. And when we put this pandemic problem behind us, I think a lot of people are going to have to turn the page on how they behaved or acted towards China in the past. Because our politicians, since John Gizzi had reminded us, since 1978, been treating China almost as our new best friend, trying to democratize them by exporting capitalism to them. And of course, what we've seen is that over the past 42 years, that has not really worked. And they have not democratized almost at all, despite opening up their marketplaces. And so what we find is that the politicians who used to support that movement towards China have to turn the page and change their approach. I think that it somewhat confirms Trump's focus initially from his initial campaign in 2016 until now, that China was a big problem for us, not only for us, but for the world. As David Hoppe pointed out, they have control over too much of the pharmaceuticals that are produced throughout the world. They provide 40% of the total world pharmaceutical ingredients. They provide the United States with 97% of our antibiotics. We don't even make penicillin in America anymore. And they have even 50% of the world's surgical masks being produced in China. That's something that we have to reverse, because what we found is that all of that really should be part of our national defense perspective. In fact, the CDC was founded in 1942. The original name of that agency was the Office of National Defense Malaria Control Activity. They changed their name in 1946 to the CDC, but removing the words national defense from their title has caused them over the decades to lose that as a focus. And I think it's important that we refocus on the idea that pharmaceuticals and our health should be tied up with our national defense. You know, Reagan had refocused our energies against the Soviet Union. He actually called the Soviet Union the focus of evil in the world. And that got everybody's attention. And the established politicians all couldn't stand that. And even Senator Ted Kennedy had a backdoor channel to Moscow and told the Soviets, don't worry, this person, and I think he did call him a clown, will soon be gone, and we can have our normalized relations again. But President Reagan was proven to be prescient and correct in foretelling the end of the Soviet Union's empire. And I'm hopeful that President Trump is just equally prescient in recognizing that China is the main focus of difficulty, and the rest of the politicians have to get on board with that, even though the established politicians really don't want to turn away from China. We do need to bring that manufacturing base home, and we do need to emphasize to our allies that they should do the same.
Very good. I'm going to ask everyone one more question, and then we will open it up for Q&A. Please, if you have a question or you're interested in further addressing a topic, please post that in the Q&A section, and we'll get to Q&A in just a few minutes, and Kylan will read us out those questions. And then before we close, I'm going to give you guys one final question that's going to be just a sort of a lightning round sum up, where I want to get kind of a quick answer from each of you. But before we get to that, the last question I want to address is there's always a tension when you're in the middle of a crisis like this between the needs of the crisis, in this case, public health and the pandemic, and the need to preserve civil liberties. And we've heard a lot about this, particularly with the stay-at-home orders, with respect to religious freedom, with respect to sort of freedom of the press, and also the freedom of economic freedom. People who are wanting to get back to work, the right to work. As we come out the other side of this, and as I said at the beginning, I think we will. How, if at all, do you think people are going to view the relationship between crisis scenarios and sort of safety and security on one hand and civil liberties on the other differently than they did before the crisis? Howard Kaloogian, we'll start with you.
Well, I think that people are going to be very suspicious of these kind of stay-at-home orders. After all, what is the authority to overrule the Bill of Rights? In America, we have a very different system of government than they do in the various European nations, and we broke from the European nations and their system of government. Our leaders are not monarchical. We the people, are the sovereigns in our country, and we have rights that we have caused to be subordinate to the powers that we've granted to the federal government and to our state governments. And yet none of those powers can abrogate our rights. So freedom of religion, you mentioned. Well, there is nothing in any of the emergency powers that the governors are relying upon that says that they have nullified the First Amendment and our right to worship as we see fit. That even means gathering in groups larger than 10 if we so choose to worship that way. And what authority do they have? I think that's a question that needs to be addressed. I don't think that they have any authority to overrule the constitutional protections that we have. In fact, every one of our elected officials swear an oath to that Constitution to uphold it and to defend it. And yet they have simply ignored it. And that is something that should play a role as we move forward. Because you see, we cannot be ruled by dictatorial authority, even if you call yourself the governor. For instance, the governor of California has issued rules throughout the state of California. Now that's 40 million people. So that the people that live in the farmland of Fresno County are being ruled the same as the people in the highly densely populated area of Los Angeles. And that makes no sense at all. The same in New York. The city of Manhattan is densely populated, and yet they have the same rules that are being put forward for upstate New York, which is very sparsely and rural in its population density. And so that makes no sense at all. It is not government by science, it is government by stupidity. We cannot consent to that in the future. They have to allow us to live our lives, and they are not currently doing that. Perhaps 80% of the population can be released from their homes and go to work. Those who have immunity compromised positions, those who have lung disease or heart disease or are elderly, they should be protected and isolated. But the rest of us really don't have that much to fear. Even if we catch coronavirus, we will have little to no symptoms, is what we're being told. And yet we are being told to avoid everyone as if they will give us the plague. You know, in the flu season of 2017, 2018, 1.6 million Americans were hospitalized. 80,000 Americans were killed because of that year's seasonal flu. And yet most people don't even remember it. It didn't cause us to shut down the economy and cause us to lose all of the jobs created since 2008. Think about that. That's an enormous amount of wealth. If we just use a round number of 10 million people who have lost their jobs, and it's going to be much higher than that. It could be as high as 30 million people by the time we're done. If you use 10 million people who have lost their jobs and they haven't worked for 30 days, that's 300 million work days lost. If the average workday is 8 hours, that's 2.4 billion man hours that have been lost. Has it been worth it? Well, we were told that we had to shut down the economy so that the hospital system wasn't overwhelmed. We were not told we're shutting down the economy to prevent deaths. That was not the stated goal. The stated goal was so that the hospitals were not overwhelmed. And what we did was we built excess capacity. We built temporary hospital beds. All of those temporary hospital beds have now been dismantled because they weren't needed. And in fact, the hospitals have laid people off because there isn't enough activity in the hospital. Not only aren't people coming in for elective procedures, but there isn't that many people being hospitalized throughout the nation. And most of the hospitals are struggling to stay afloat and laying off their workers. So I really think we do have to turn the page and revisit how we address all of this in the future.
Pivoting to Dr. Perron, from the European perspective, you know, are you seeing the same sort of tensions between civil liberties and economic activity and sort of health, safety, and security have an impact on the politics in countries in Europe that you're following right now, as what Howard Kaloogian just described in the United States? And if not, why not? What would you say the difference is if that's not happening?
It is happening. And there is a debate in social media about it. And I think it's good that we talk about those issues because, as is being said, liberty is one of those goods that gets worn out by not using it. So, and a crisis like this can always be politicized and abused. This being said, in this particular crisis, I think people should relax a little bit. I mean, the cabinet members, the presidents, the governors, the mayors I've known usually don't want to be the ones who throw the economy against the wall. I mean, usually you don't want to govern over an economic downturn. So I would give them the benefit of the doubt that what they're doing is really because they think it is needed, and based on their advisors and their hopefully medical advisors, they think it is needed. I don't think they do this out of pleasure. And frankly, to me, some of these protesters I see look kind of nuts. I mean, maybe we should chill a little bit in this respect. And I would like to add another point. I am surprised to hear on a panel that is has a religious connotation, this whole debate about, is it really worth it? I'm not religious, particularly myself, but I guess many of you guys are. So I'm surprised to hear this debate. Well, is it really worth to save our lives? Is it really worth all this spending to save a few lives? I find it from not religious, but humanist perspective quite shocking. And yes, we can start debate about whether we want to save lives of people who would die anyway, sooner or later. But I find it very dangerous and appalling, frankly.
So, yeah, go ahead.
May I comment on that?
Sure.
I don't want to leave the impression that it's lives versus money. That is not the debate. The debate is lives versus lives. It's how to best protect the lives. And one of the best ways is developing herd immunity. And you cannot develop herd immunity if you are shut in. The people who need to be protected.
UK was saying, and look how it worked out for them. The prime minister is at the emergency room and looks like a fool.
The people who need protection should be protected.
Right.
Those who are not in need of being protected should not have all of their liberties dismantled from them.
So,
And the government is not actually having an effect of their own rules. The ruling elite do not suffer the consequences of their own rulemaking, and that's something that we have to address as well.
let's move on. And I do want to just point out to folks that for a really in-depth discussion of these sort of religious, theological, and Christian faith-based aspects of this crisis, you can listen to the live stream of our first panel, which was on Christian stewardship in the coronavirus. And maybe someone, for those who missed that panel, we can hopefully pop the link to that in the chat, because I think that panel really substantively and thoughtfully, I think, addressed a lot of these questions. Moving on to Dr. Pavel Kaleta, yeah, I've noticed that, particularly pivoting back to the Eastern European sector and looking at Russia, we have seen also moves by President Putin to extend his term out even further in the midst of this coronavirus. There have been a number of different responses by various different governments in sort of Eastern and Central Europe to this. I wonder if you could comment on some of those responses and how some of these liberty and security dynamics are playing out in the politics of Eastern Europe.
Well, again, perhaps to use a few worn-out expressions, Russia is always a mystery wrapped in an enigma. And again, we're looking to Russia. Well, one could say that we here were always looking to Russia, towards Russia. However, to come to the point, I must admit that the reactions in Europe or in Western Europe have been somewhat broad in their range, but with all due respect, I think at the end of the day, what matters in the Russian context is what happens in Russia. On one hand, we see that all these grandiose plans for changing the constitution, the referendum, prolonging, in essence, the rule of the current president have had to be put on hold because of the emergency. And that's already a very interesting sign. On the other hand, if you'd ask me, and at the risk of sounding cynical, I really don't think that this Russian power authority steamroller is going to be stopped for very long by such a trifle and passing event as the pandemics is, from the point of view of the Kremlin. I would say that once the present crisis passes on, more or less, when the curve is flattened or there's not so many ill people and the deaths number is sooner or later abating a little, we'll see that the activities towards, well, perpetuating the power of the president will resume rather quickly. However, if I might also come back perhaps 3 steps to this interesting exchange of views we've had a moment ago, on perhaps the religious aspect, religious freedom aspect of our discussion. Just perhaps one word of the commentary, maybe not in terms of freedom as such, but just a factual observation, which I think might be of interest, bearing in mind it comes from a country like Poland, in a region like Central and Eastern Europe. I must say that this current crisis must be the first one in a very long time, trying broad event encompassing the entire society, where one cannot observe, not even in Western Europe, not in here, but as I see it popping up in discussions, I don't see any sort of for lack of a better word, revival in terms of religion. There is no flocking to the churches, not only for the reason that there is a lockdown or social isolation ordered, but in general, trying times called for a greater run, rallying not only around the flag, but around your church, your religious community. I must say, even in a country like Poland, I'm not observing this in this present crisis, in this present pandemics. And once again, this is not only because of the social physical distancing norms. As I mentioned, this is just an observation. I'm not trying to take a position here, but I dare say this might be something of interest. I hope that would be sufficient.
Yeah, absolutely. And that might be an interesting thread to follow, perhaps in the Q&A time period. Pivoting to
For about a quarter
Age-
after, I think we should maybe start our Q&A to get a couple in before the Attorney General gets here.
sure, and we do have a hard stop. I'll just throw it open to our remaining panelists that haven't had a chance to talk. Anybody have a real quick thought that you want to interject on this topic?
I do. AJ.
Go for it.
Okay. With all due respect to Dr. Paletta, may I tell him about the flocking to the churches? The reason that he can't see it is because it's all virtual. The National Council of Evangelicals recently did its State of the Plate survey, which showed because there is no attendance in churches, donations for churches were down in about 66% of churches through the United States, and this covers all faiths. However, virtual observing of church services is up two times, sometimes 5 times what it was before the virus started. And what he believes is that worship will grow as a result of this, but it just may not be people actually going there, but watching the services and praying online. And in many ways, they've worked out ways to get donations from this. So I categorically disagree with the idea that faith is not being turned to at this point. He just can't see it.
Very interesting. All right. So with that,
Excuse me, that's why I qualified my remarks in geographical terms, to my point of view, to what I can see from my, let's say, East Central and Eastern European Polish perspective.
very good. All right. Let's pivot to some questions from the Q&A. Kylan, do you have a couple of questions queued up for us?
Yeah, so first I want to start with one from Dr. Manjiki and another RSG professor. She asks or states that populist movements often get a bad rap for being anti-intellectual. Is a populist movement going to inevitably be in conflict with advice being given to us by epidemiologists or scientists? Is there any way to navigate cooperation between them?
All right. Can we see the emergence of a sort of a pro-expert populism? Anyone want to sort of take that question?
Well, let me make a comment. First of all, there's a tyranny, there's a danger of the tyranny of the expertise. And while it is, expertise should be used, it should not be worshipped. And I think to the degree, as Pope Benedict the 16th talked about many times, there really isn't a division between faith and reason. They work together. And when they work together, they both perform best. And I think that's the understanding we have to come to. But looking at the writings of Pope Benedict and the statements of Pope Benedict when he was talking about faith and reason, I think may be an answer to that question. But one thing I do warn people of, don't worship expertise, use it. That's what it's there for, to be used, not to go beyond that and to be worshiped.
Very good. Any other responses to that question?
Well, I would just agree with David Hoppe. He's got an excellent point. I think it was Winston Churchill who said that war is too important to be left to the generals. And that's because each expert develops their expertise in a silo. In order to become an expert, whether you're an epidemiologist or a scientist of any kind, it takes many years, usually even decades of not only study, but experience in order to become a true expert. But that necessarily means that your expertise is narrow. And therefore, your ability to apply it in general to a country of 350 million people, as diverse as we are, becomes something that means you're not the decision maker. You can make recommendations, as Mr. Hoppe said, it shouldn't be worshipped. It should be accepted as good advice, but it should be taken as only one perspective. We cannot be ruled by experts because their expertise is too narrow. It doesn't include the general, I think what Aristotle would have called governing idea of prudence, which is more along the lines of common sense.
Very good. I think we have time for one more quick response to this question, if anyone wants to offer one. All right, hearing none. Kylan, let's pivot to our next question.
Sure, here's another question from a Regent professor, Dr. Stephen King. One of the primary economic post-pandemic issues is how to address supply chains. Should the US act unilaterally in reshifting supply chains away from China, or should the US act multilaterally with other affected nations to address this problem?
All right, let's get our three US panelists to chime in on this question quickly, and then maybe some thoughts from some of our international experts.
Well, I would argue the US ought to act internationally to do this, but it may be in bilateral ways. We may do one with Britain, we may do one with Australia, but we have to act with our allies in the world on this, because I don't see a particular problem in supply chains that go through Australia or ones that go through France, or pick another country in the world who is an ally broadly defined of the United States. But I do see it in going through our adversaries. And so I think that it has to be an international thing, because the US cannot be and cannot provide all of this, the full supply chain. But we have to know where the critical elements are coming from, and that they will freely come to us when we need it. And we will freely work with other nations when they need it.
All right.
May I say something
Yes,
in this regard?
Absolutely. Please do.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, it's better than we to look at the globalization than just to make it a United States and China. I guess we are going, or we need to question the globalization, especially the hardcore one, which is undermines the stability and the prosperity for many developing nations and societies. On the other hand, we need as well to review or reconsider the whole global economy. It's not going to work like that in the future. The global economy system driven by Bretton Woods agreement reached after the Second World War, we need to get a new one. Having under consideration all these changes which we are witnessing right now in the world economy. Thank you.
All right. Anyone else on the supply chain? Okay, Kylan, next question.
So this is a question from David Reichling from Facebook Live. He is wondering how the MENA nations are collaborating to combat the spread of the virus.
All right, so nations in the Middle East and North Africa. Fala Musa, let's start with you on that. Have you seen a lot of collaboration between nations in the region on how to fight coronavirus?
No, absolutely, actually. As I have mentioned before, all what is happening there is about power and saving money. They are politicizing, actually, the pandemic. We see that a lot of governments there, they are just taking advantage of corona crisis to clamp down the opposition and to boost their power. So this is all about, actually. We see in Iraq, Egypt, Turkey, there are thousands of people, they were arrested just because they have posted some information about corona pandemic on the social media. So there are really serious fears about the human rights in this region, when the governments are using the pandemic to enforce control, censorship, and to violate the human rights. So in terms of cooperation, absolutely, there is no cooperation. There is no, it's only isolation what we are witnessing there. The conflict, the wars in Syria and Libya and Yemen, they are continue as usual, like there's nothing. Nobody is thinking about stopping these wars and conflicts and give more attention for the human being and for saving the people. We saw as well in Iraq and in Lebanon, it was very easy. For 2 months, they just imposed a curfew. It's not a shutdown, but totally nobody is working. All they are sitting home. And of course, there is no social help. The government, they are not thinking about the people who are not getting salaries as a civil servant or state employees. People who are working on taxi, who are, they have shops or restaurants, nobody is working. But the government is not interested about supporting these people as it has happened in many countries. Unfortunately, the situation is very seriously bad in the Middle East, and especially in Arab world, including, of course, Iran. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Dr. Musa. We have a hard stop at 12:30, so I think we have time, Kylan, if you have one more really quick question.
Yeah, so I guess I'll go for one from Professor Jones. What lessons can we draw from the Swedish response to this crisis as compared to that of California?
All right. We're going to go actually back to Fala Musa, who has the PhD from a Swedish university. Would you like to address anything on the Swedish response?
Yeah, actually, this is very unique, I think, because the Swedish authority, they believe more on the people. They believe more that the people are responsible. They didn't use any kind of shutdown because they respected the rights of the people to move, the rights of the people to socialize as well. So they didn't touch these rights. They kept everything going on normally, but they always encourage the people, of course, to stay home, to keep the right distance, to use the public transportation as less as possible. But they didn't shut anything except, of course, the universities and the secondary schools. Thank you.
All right, Howard Kalugian, I'm going to assume that you would probably not say the California response is one that people should emulate.
It doesn't make any sense. You can't treat Los Angeles and upstate California the same. It's about something else. I mean, how is it that there's more deaths by cancer than there is by coronavirus? And yet we're not shutting down the economy until we solve or cure cancer. And yet if we spent $10 trillion trying to solve or cure cancer, we probably would have cured it. And that's probably a low estimate as to what it's going to cost us in fighting coronavirus. And we're not going to defeat it. The coronavirus is in the world as a permanent feature of the world. So who is to say that we can't come out of our homes until it goes away, because it's not going away. And so this government by experts says, well, we're going to decide whose job is essential. But that's not by science either, because if it was by science, then everybody's decision as to what job is essential would be the same from state to state to state, and it's totally different. Some places allow landscapers to go to work, other places don't. Some places allow a hardware store to open, but not sell seeds to grow vegetables and tomatoes. It makes no sense. It's arbitrary. It's not science. And besides, my job is essential to me and to my family. And that should be the rallying cry of everybody who wants to protest the stay-at-home order, that my job is essential to me and my family. And some faraway bureaucrat in Washington, D.C. or the state capitol can't decide that my job is not essential. Essential to who? Makes no sense.
Thank you very much. John Gizzi, I want to give you the last word and sort of broaden the question a little bit. When we look back on the coronavirus, the biggest political lesson that you think we will draw from it would be fill in the blank.
John, you're muted.
What? Oops.
Oh, there you go.
No. Okay, here. All right, thank you. Thank you, David, for pointing that out. The answer is very simple. Get an early start on things. I mentioned Taiwan earlier. One reason that they are able to take the lead in dealing with a crisis such as coronavirus, they got an early start on everything. And countries, one finds, that did the hard chores early, that bit the bullet early on, closing things, are now the ones that are gradually reopening with confidence. Austria, the Czech Republic, and Denmark are other cases in point. I think that so much could have been avoided if one simply had got an earlier handle on this and taken the hard steps early on. This entire conversation, as with the national dialogue, would be entirely different.
Thank you very much. That is an excellent note to close what has been a really substantive, thoughtful, and engaging panel. Thank you all so much for your participation. And with that, right at 12:30, I will hand things back over to Dean Perry.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nolte, and thank you all to our panelists. Again, yeah, it's been very stimulating conversation. You know, I just hope as we look forward to the future that whatever the governments do, that we as individuals, that people have a long-term view for their own welfare and their own safety, and that we just think about what things we might have to do. You know, I think a lot of times people didn't believe we'd ever be in a situation like we've been in for the last couple of months. So looking to our future, you know, those of you who are attending, you've been listening to What's Next? Forecasting the post-pandemic landscape. And we certainly have gotten great forecasting today on a lot of things that may come in the wake of this. And to wrap up our series, we have a series of webinars we've been doing, Keep the Flame Burning, Fueling the Fire of Representative Democracy in a Time of Social Isolation. And so we have a special guest with us who is going to deliver our closing address. And so welcome to Attorney General and Distinguished Professor of Law and Government at Regent University, John Ashcroft. And we're glad to have him here to deliver our closing remarks today. Let me just introduce him to you. After Mr. Ashcroft gives our closing address, we will have a closing prayer from Dr. Cornay Becker, who is also joining us, and he will wrap us up with a benedictory prayer for us. But Attorney General John Ashcroft was raised in Springfield, Missouri. He has a JD from the law school at the University of Chicago. He graduated cum laude from Yale University. In 1973, Mr. Ashcroft served as Missouri Auditor, followed by 2 terms as Missouri Attorney General. Mr. Ashcroft served as Governor of Missouri from 1985 through 1993, where, get this, he balanced 8 consecutive budgets. Fortune magazine rated him one of the top 10 education governors, while Financial World and City and State magazines credited him with making Missouri one of the best financially managed states. In 1991, the nonpartisan National Governors Association voted him its chairman. Mr. Ashcroft was elected to the U.S. Senate in 1994 and worked to reduce crime and safeguard the rights of crime victims. President George W. Bush announced his decision to nominate John Ashcroft to serve as U.S. Attorney General on December 22, 2000. As U.S. Attorney General, Ashcroft reorganized the Justice Department to focus on its #1 priority, to prevent another terrorist attack, leveraging every legal tool available to law enforcement, including the critical tools provided in the U.S. Patriot Act. The Justice Department initiated a tough anti-terrorism campaign. That has assisted in disrupting over 150 terrorist plots worldwide, dismantling terrorist cells in cities across America, and convicting over 190 individuals to date in terrorism-related investigations. One of the most high-profile and experienced attorney generals in the nation's history, Mr. Ashcroft led the U.S. law enforcement community through the challenging and transformational period following the tragic attacks of September 11, 2001. His tenure was highlighted by forceful public advocacy of President Bush's strong anti-terrorism strategy. His quiet government influence was rated highest inside the Bush administration by the National Journal. In 2005, Mr. Ashcroft was named a distinguished professor in the schools of law and government at Regent University. Today, Mr. Ashcroft serves as the chairman of the Ashcroft Group, LLC, which provides confidential strategic consulting and crisis counseling to major international corporations. Thank you again for joining us, Mr. Ashcroft, and please share with us what you have.
Thank you, Dean Perry. I want to say hello to Dave Hoppe. We served in the United States Senate together, and it was a pleasure to see him. I enjoyed very much the discussion of the previous panel, and I would have relished more my ability to be involved in that discussion than trying to wind things up. So may I suggest that if at any time during these closing remarks I make, someone would ask me a question and shift me from talking about what I'm interested in to talking about what they're interested in, it would do us all a big favor. So I thank you very much. It's my understanding that this consideration of what the landscape will be after this episode of pandemic COVID-19 is a very interesting discussion, but forecasting the future is a very difficult enterprise. But maybe there are some things that we should learn from what's happened. In terms of our culture, I think there are going to be some interesting things that'll be different about our culture, and some of them are things that are regrettable to me. I would prefer perhaps that they not be that way. But I think more Americans will be accustomed to receiving government aid as a result of what happens both in and around this. People will expect, I think, a different kind of safety net, especially if we're successful in the safety net efforts that are made with the so-called supplementals and other appropriations that are being made. This brings into question something about our culture, and that is to the extent that our culture is characterized as a culture of independence from government or dependence on government. And I'm afraid that events like this, if we're not careful, sort of swing the needle for the population, especially when the population is moved in such great numbers into the receipt of significant government checks, moves them into the category of being more willing to be dependent, less intentional about being independent. So that's a cultural thing. Another thing which has been discussed and is mentioned is the idea of privacy. The American public has been on a roller coaster of privacy concerns since the early 1970s or late 60s, when we had the Supreme Court find in the Constitution privacy as a right, which was not specifically mentioned in the Constitution. And it has been adjudicated as a right for things that are private to remain private. But I think the American people have evolved their idea or desire for privacy to include things that really are public, but they just want to remain anonymous about them. Sometimes our advertising culture is as instructive about who we are and tells us what we think as anything else. And I was always amused by the ad, what happens in Las Vegas stays in Las Vegas. The idea that you could do things in broad daylight, or in Las Vegas in broad nightlight, and it would still not be available to be understood by anybody because it's your own business. It's privacy redefined as things not by virtue of things done out of the sight of other people, but things that relate to you personally in your own, quote, business. And with the proposals about contact tracing and all that relate to the effort to interdict the sort of the impact of this virus in the culture, I think there are very serious ramifications relating to privacy, particularly this pandemic provides, with the technology we now have, the ability to trace people in their contacts and where they've been. A few months ago, I was in Washington, D.C., and on my way to the airport, I stopped at a restaurant on the Virginia side, and within moments after I had stopped there, and I didn't pay the bill, this was part of my old cheapo habit of letting someone else pick up the check. my phone rang with a survey about how did I like the restaurant. It wasn't obviously from my having registered as a guest of the restaurant, but it was simply the ability of people to trace where I was by virtue of the technology that I carried. Everybody virtually carries these technological devices now. And if we have a situation where tracing is deemed to be fundamental to our existence, we will have made a very significant change in our view toward privacy. I don't think the people will accept that readily, but I say that that's one of the things that might be understood. Elections themselves could be changed. I think it's pretty clear that there is going to be an increased demand for people to be able to participate in our electoral system without undertaking what they consider to be the risks of encountering other individuals in circumstances that don't provide for social distancing, or even in circumstances do provide for social distancing. So I would expect there will be an increased demand for absentee balloting, perhaps for mail-in balloting, perhaps for a kind of balloting that would include extended intervals during which ballots could be cast. And those have ramifications. I think first of all, in a democracy, in a representative democracy, in a constitutional democracy, which probably best defines our system, because democracy is not the number one value in my mind of what America's about. Democracy is a process. Liberty is a value, and America is about the value of liberty. That's why our founders didn't talk much about democracy. The key words for the people at the founding of this country were liberty. And I do, since everyone else has quoted Winston Churchill this morning, I'll quote him as well. He said, democracy is the worst form of government except for everything else we've tried. And I tend to agree with him there. It's the best. But it should be something that we use in order to affect an outcome, democracy being the process. Liberty, we hope, being the outcome, because we, I think, still maintain a value that free people and independent people are the most productive and happy people. And for those of us with the kind of religious understanding, we believe that's the way God intended us to be, that God respected liberty and freedom so profoundly that he even allows us to choose against God. And that's a profound sort of underlining of the concept of liberty. So elections and confidence in elections is fundamental. In order for there to be confidence, I think there have to be two major components of an election: integrity and access. The access has to be given to people who are eligible to vote. And that can't be given in such a way that it is reckless or is not controlled, so that people who vote twice instead of voting once and cancel out the votes of others, or people ineligible to vote cancel out the votes of those who are eligible by virtue of an ineligible vote being weighed against one of eligibility and qualification. And so you have this idea of access and integrity, and then, but the need to give people the opportunity to vote. And when you have an expanded voting interval, you run the risk of not really gauging the sentiment of the public in any accurate way. I guess I would illustrate it best by saying, if you were on trial and halfway through the trial, the jury was invited, if they chose to stand up and cast their ballots for innocence or guilt and walk away, you would lose confidence in the value of the jury, because there needed to be a full range of information and an identical range provided to all the people. When people vote 3 or 4 months in advance, or even sometimes several weeks in advance, they miss some of the most important judgmental factors that might be the occasion for their making decisions. So I think we have to be very careful about any adjustment in the election process. Some states that are considering expanded access for absentee ballots, for example, are considering sunsetting the provisions. That means that those provisions would be in existence during this time of crisis, but not necessarily extended into other settings. This raises an issue which I think is valuable, and that is decision-making in times of crisis is dangerous, because people tend to short-circuit some of the rationality that ought and consideration that ought to otherwise attend decision-making. So I think in times of crisis, decisions ought to be incremental instead of monumental, if I might say so. Those people, including all the famous people who have said a crisis is a terrible thing to waste, are usually people who have a different agenda, an agenda which the people might not embrace otherwise, but they think they might sneak it through under the banner of a crisis. We watch this happen in our Congress all the time, and I have to say that as a United States Senator, I watched it happen and reluctantly participated from time to time, because you have to vote on entire legislations, but they call it Christmas treeing. If there's something that's got to go through, they hang all kinds of extra stuff on it because they can take through the process something that couldn't make it through on its own and with the broad daylight of consideration rationally undertaken by the legislative body. So fine tuning is always available, and course correction is easier on incremental decisions than on monumental decisions. And if the correction is not really capable of being made or susceptible to being made, if it's an incremental decision, it doesn't steer you nearly as far off course as a monumental decision does. This was true when we handled the Patriot Act after 9/11. It was a pretty big decision, but we swept authorities that were available in other parts of the law into the Patriot Act. And these authorities had already been exercised and had already been validated, tested by the courts and the like. And it reduced the risk of making decisions in a crisis period. And I think that's reflected in the fact now it was passed by 98 votes in its initial form. When it came back to be strengthened, it only was passed by 88 votes. But very honestly, 88 votes is a substantial majority in the United States Senate. I was fond of saying you couldn't convince senators to agree that it's Wednesday, 88% of the votes. It's very hard to get that kind of agreement. So I would just say that incremental decision-making instead of monumental decision-making is what suits us best in times of crisis. Look, I've probably been on the ballot more times than everybody else on the panel. I was on a statewide ballot in 72, 76, 1980, 84, 88, 94, the year 2000, and what you learn when you're in elections is that you don't know very much about elections, is that lots of outside factors. If you win, you tend to think everything you did was right. If you lose, people think everything you did was wrong. And it may well be that other outside factors really were the controlling factors in your fate. But I would say this, that as a person who's the only person in the universe that I know of that lost his Senate seat to a deceased opponent, you should not ask me to forecast election outcomes, especially in uncertain times. But this time is very uncertain. I would just add one other thing. Public officials, I think, are largely doing their best in settings like this. They are loath to be responsible for calamity that's imposed either economically or otherwise. And I think that the idea that the epidemiologists can tell us what the health impacts will be does not settle any issue. We have to figure out what what they are always pointing to the disease impacts in our health, but they don't really tell us about the economic health impacts as well. And I'm talking about personal health issues, but depression, and I'm talking about economic depression as well as emotional depression, and poverty have personal health impacts. They have life and death impacts on people. So I wanted to just throw that into the mix, that those should be considered. And I think that's what the president is doing. He understands that it's not merely people living and dying on the basis of what we do in terms of shutdown. It's people living and dying on the basis of when we can generate a startup. The last point I would make is that presidential powers are very significant in emergency settings. And that relates in a significant way to the authority of a president as commander-in-chief. It relates even to the Bill of Rights. When the president's powers are to be exercised, now I'm not saying that this is a case in which they are. I think it's understood that sometimes those can displace even rights as important as those expressed in the Bill of Rights. When in the Second World War, the president imposed certain kinds of rights regarding shutting down the lights on the coast of California so that Japanese submarines couldn't locate the cities properly. Among those lights that had to be turned off were church lights. And I don't believe that was beyond the president's authority at a time when there was a serious threat. So balancing the rights, the president's responsibility is expressed in the Constitution, and the Constitution in its main body is no less important than the Bill of Rights. When balancing those rights is sometimes delicate. And there were times when they were balanced in the Second World War in favor of the presidency that people are not convinced now that balance was proper, but the court at the time felt it was proper because in some measure the court felt the nature of the threat. So it's with those kinds of complicated and difficult decisions that we find ourselves in the post-pandemic landscape, if we are at the post-pandemic stage yet. I'd like to think that I am, but a person of my age may just become post-period. He may be over and he may be finished. Regardless of that, whether I am as a person or not, I think it's pretty clear that my time is up now. And I commend Regent University for assembling the kind of talent and the kind of interesting panelists that have really helped us understand this issue. And asking the right questions and debating the right issues is the stuff of which good decision making is made.
Thank you so much, Mr. Ashcroft, for your great comments. Some fine points that, dependence on government safety nets, our concern of the election process, decisions during time of crisis being incremental, not monumental, balancing the needs of times of crisis to our Bill of Rights. I mean, there's just a lot of things there. I think these points and the points made on our earlier panel are really going to help our faculty as they teach classes. I think it'd be very likely that this panel will be used drawing some of these points into courses in national security, courses in policy making. And we have a campaign strategy and management sequence concentration that we certainly can see a lot of this applying. So anyway, thank you so much for all of you. You're contributing to our students and to the welfare of our university. And thank you, Mr. Ashcroft, for your comments today. Thank you to our attendees as well. And we do want to just close this out. Thank you for staying with us. We want to close this out with the Dean of our School of Divinity, Dr. Cornay Becker, who is going to deliver to us a closing benediction prayer.
Thank you so much, Dr. Perry. Let us pray together. Most high and glorious God, in the name of your Son, Jesus Christ, through the power of your Spirit, we pray that you will bless the people of this great country. Bless their freedom, bless their independence, bless their creativity. But Lord, we pray that you would unite the people. We pray for everyone that's in a position of government. Use them mightily for your glory. So to him who is able to keep us from stumbling and to present us faultless before the presence of his glory with exceeding joy, to him alone be the glory, majesty, dominion, and power through Jesus Christ our Savior, now and forever. Amen.
Amen. Again, thank you. Thank you to everyone who's attended, and God bless.